This is Robert Burr, and you're with us today with the Miami Pioneers and Natives of Dade. And this is our January 9th, 2022 meeting. And today we have with us archaeologist Bob Carr, who is well known for his work in Dade County. And now to give Bob a proper introduction, I'll hand it over to Cesar Becerra.
Greetings, everybody. Greetings. Thank you, Robert, for this opportunity to introduce a good friend of mine, Bob Carr, who I've been friends with from years and years. In fact, I first met Bob when I worked at the Deering Estate a long time ago and interviewed him at the top of the stairs of the carriage house for a documentary called Miami's Living Memories, the importance of interviewing pioneers for historical research. And that just goes to show you that Bob Carr is not just an archaeologist, he feels this stuff deeply. And some of his work and some of his clues and some of his, crumb trails that he follows does come from people. And he's had a long association with Miami and its people. He's the co-founder of the Archaeological and Historical Conservancy, now located in Davie. And I like to go by there every now and then and drop off a little historical gift that he doesn't know is coming every now and then. He served as its full-time director since 1999. Worked as an archaeologist for the state of Florida's Division of Historic Resources for the National Park Service. One of my favorite stories of Bob Carr, and I hope he'll elaborate on this, Bob, maybe even start with this, but it was the time you were dropped off in the middle of nowhere on a helicopter ride. And as the helicopter lifted off, you stopped hearing the whir of the blades, but you heard something else. But I'm going to let him tell you that. He has a master's degree in anthropology at Florida State University, former editor of the Florida Anthropologist, and former president of the Florida Archaeological Council. And he's a recipient of the Bullen Award and received Florida's Historic Preservation Award in 2003. And today in presenting a subject that I approached him, thanks to Robert Burr telling me, go ahead and let's invite Bob, is the story of his association for many years of Brickell Point in honor of this week's 100th anniversary of the passing of Mary Brickell. So Bob, take it away. Welcome.
Well, it's good to be here. My first meeting of sorts since the beginning of the pandemic, so I'm glad to participate and know that there's so many interested people here. I'll start by saying that my love affair with Miami began as a boy, and when I say love affair, I mean in terms of this great interest and curiosity about the city's history and about the city's past. And many of you have heard this before, I'm sure, but it began in the 7th grade when I was in Ada Merritt Junior High, as they called it back then. And my 7th grade teacher, Mrs. Murphy, started telling us about the earliest people of Miami, and they were the Seminoles. And I thought, okay, well, it's the Seminoles. Well, only a week later, one of my classmates, Mark Green, came into the class with a shoebox filled with artifacts, and he was starting to show pieces of animal bones and this extraordinary axe, a very small axe made out of basaltic rock that he had found, as it turned out, on the south bank of the Miami River. And I said, Mark, I'm really amazed and fascinated by what you found. I said, can you show me where you found that? He said, no, I can't. This is my secret site, he said. Well, it took about 3 days worth of my lunch money to convince him otherwise. In doing so, we became actually really good friends, and we're still friends today. And Mark and I went to that location, which is now currently Size River Gate, including the parcel that we're currently working on, which is on Southeast 5th Street, where the old U.S. Customs House had been and was demolished. And now we're doing essentially a phase 3 recovery of this massive archaeological deposit that's located on that parcel. But back in 1962, I was there as a kid, and there was this small mound that was about 3 feet high near the bank of the river. And Mark and I decided that summer that we were going to excavate it. Now, you got to keep in mind, we didn't have any guidance and any idea of what the ethics of archaeology may or may not be. So as we began to excavate, we had an understanding that we would dig. I would do the drawings of the artifacts. He would help write, and then he would type it up. And we spent the summer carefully digging with our spoons and little trowels. And we knew enough in our minds not to go to the middle of the mound. We wanted to save that for last, so we were actually digging sides inward, almost like a pizza pie. And near the end of the summer, as we approached the end of August, we were brushing away, and we, instead of finding these little animal bone fragments, instead of finding shell refuse, we began to hear a sound that was unfamiliar. It was a metallic sound. And as we brushed and brushed, we began to uncover the mystery of this mound. And that mystery was that it was a Model T Ford. And that Model T Ford had been scooped or excavated out of the river back in the 1920s or 30s, and it had come up with all these artifacts. So in the end, we hadn't actually destroyed any kind of mound, but we'd gotten a lesson in DeCesta archaeology, which stuck with us for the rest of our lives. We began to go to the library in Bayfront Park and found there was a journal called the Florida Anthropologist, began reading about sites that had been found and recorded by archaeologist John Goggin and Dan Laxon, who was very, very active in the 1950s and 1960s. And that began my career and my growing knowledge of what would become Dade County's archaeological mecca, because unknown to most people is that the extent of the DeCesta footprint in Dade County was immense, and that there are literally hundreds of sites from the DeCesta, most of those in the Everglades, but many along the coast as well, all of them hidden and buried because modern Miami had been built over the prehistoric footprint. And now, today, we still have that opportunity to document these sites before they're destroyed, because, for example, the Miami Circle is under the Brickell Apartments, which had been built in 1948. But construction techniques in those earlier days in Miami often involved bringing fill onto the parcel. So inadvertently, they were creating a time capsule with those sites by covering it with fill, and that fill protected those sites. So underneath the Brickell Apartments, the most easterly building, was the entirety of the Miami Circle, perfectly preserved, even with the wall of the foundation of the building going right across the middle of the circle. It never went deep enough to actually penetrate into the circle itself. So that was an incredible discovery, to realize that the circle was preserved and that so much of Miami was preserved. But going to the heart of that early interest, quickly went from that mound to a location very close by, very close to the Brickell Apartments, and that was the Brickle House itself. At that time, in 1961, Mary, I believe it was Maud Brickell, was living there. That's the daughter of Mary and William Brickell. And Mark and I were very curious about what we thought was this incredibly ancient house, this beautiful terror-like house from Gone with the Wind, just coming up out of the coconut grove there on the point, Brickell Point. We had never seen anything like that in Miami. And so we were kind of awed by it. We would walk through Brickell Park and we would look at the house, and we kept a fair distance from it because she had a large pack of dogs that were always barking whenever we got anywhere near it. And the day came where Maud Brickell died and the house became vacant. And Mark and I found the courage to go underneath the house. It was a cross several feet high. And there, littered through the bottom of the house across the grounds, were literally hundreds of artifacts, including thousands of glass beads from the Brickell trading post. And we would collect those and record them and begin what was the archaeological component of the Brickell House. So that house that we thought was so ancient apparently was built in 1908. And the day came, Maud Brickell had donated that house to the city along with the park, with the idea of having this to the family. She had already leased out or sold part of the property to the American Legion post that had a building constructed in the 1950s, 58, very close to the house. And that day that Mark and I were there, we saw with great sadness the destruction of the house. First, to believe it hidden tens of thousands of dollars in gold and bills in the house. And in looking for that, they began to destroy the house by breaking the walls. All the walls were smashed, broken. Everything was broken in the house. All the furniture that remained was destroyed. It was a very sad and sobering reality for boys of, at that time, I think we were about 13 or 14. And we were very disappointed that the city decided to take the gift of that house and demolish it. They said because of the ruinous condition, but frankly, they had no interest in trying to maintain this site as a historic structure. So we saw the demise of the house and the bulldozing of it. And after that, we found more artifacts and began to realize the wealth of history that were preserved in that one location. Brickell House, as it turned out, structure, one of the first Dade County courthouse built in the 1850s was located pretty much at the same location. So we were finding artifacts going back to the 19th century and even earlier. And then I saw something under the house that I didn't know what it meant at the time. And years later, I began to put together that puzzle, that the dirt at Brickell Park, the midden dirt, is a very dark black organic midden. And this is where most of these artifacts occur. But there was a huge lens under the house of white sand. And in that white sand were dozens of human teeth, prehistoric teeth, and no bones that we could see, but carved bone artifacts that were very unusual and polished and were not like anything we'd ever found. We knew they were special and we didn't know why they were there. But I have the theory now that the Brickell House actually sat on top of a burial mound. And when they were either developing the courthouse or building the Brickell House itself, they leveled the burial mound, and those remains were just under the house. Many years later, I got to go back there, first because there was a very interesting situation in the 1990s, early 2000s, I believe, where the city had created an inventory of parks in the city of Miami that they thought were serving any useful public purpose. And Brickell Park was one of those. So there was an attempt to sell Brickell Park to a developer in New York. None of this that I know of was ever in the public record in terms of any commission meetings. Excuse me. It was part of that backyard politics, backdoor politics that was common maybe in a lot of cities. But the developer had the prudence to contact me and ask me to go.
I think we might have lost Bob for a second there. Let's give him a chance to come back in.
Lost out there. I'm back. Harry?
Yes, I think you're coming back now, Bob.
I think I left off where I was talking about that the city had Brickell Park on their inventory list for sale.
Yes.
And there was a very serious attempt to sell that park to a developer. And the developer reached out to me and asked me to determine if there was any archaeological significance to the park before he bought it. So I was able to do archaeological. Fortunately, I found coming and going. Hello? Anybody there?
I think you're back. Yeah.
All right. As a result of excavations, the testing, the developer backed out, and I was able to give a message directly to the commissioners and talk to them and say that this is a really bad idea. And the commissioner, who will remain nameless, said, "What are you talking about? That's no park." He said, "There's nobody in there, homeless people, drunks." And he said, "If we develop it, then people will be getting a use out of it." And he said, "Park is life." He said, "In my country, park places where people go, where people gather." I said, "Well, those aren't parks, really." I said, "Those are plazas." He was talking about Cuba. And I said, "Those are plazas. Those are designed for people to gather, and they're surrounded by boats. This is a green space park." This really was very foreign to him, and he thought it was a really wasted property. Eventually, the related group acquired the property where the Holiday Inn and then the Sheraton were built, on where the Brickell House was. And we had the opportunity to do archaeology there again. And then we worked with the related group when they decided that they were going to create the apartments and condos. And during that time, we worked hard to make sure that the park was not part of the developmental equation. I can tell you that it was challenging in the beginning to do that. There were a lot of pressures on the city to provide access. And the good news is Icon Brickell did a superb job, not in maintaining, not only maintaining the park, but in redeveloping it and turning it into the very kind of public space that the commissioner had talked about. Anytime you go there now, there's dozens and dozens of people, families and children. And of course, that's part of the redevelopment of that whole Brickell area. But in the end, it's preserved along with the mausoleum that was constructed in 1921. And it's still there. I'll take just a break for a moment and just ask at this point if there's any questions. I'm not sure I'll hear them though, so you may have to.
You can unmute yourself if you'd like to ask a question, if that's easy to do. Becky, what would you like to ask?
Yes, you mentioned a courthouse being there at one point, and I never heard that. I always thought the courthouse was at Fort Dallas at one point, but tell me when that was.
Well, there's a map from 1855. It's a government map dealing with the Third Seminole War, and depicted on that map, there's a rectangular footprint of a structure, and it actually is labeled courthouse. So apparently, the courthouse was briefly in the residence of one of the early settlers at that location.
Oh.
That is very interesting. Yeah, I wasn't aware of that, and that's obviously, yeah, that would have been, they would have had to clear out some of the mound to build that structure. And I think, wasn't Florida maybe under military jurisdiction back at that time? I don't know.
Well, in all practical purposes, it was, and the military was using much of the mouth of the river for their own purposes, specifically for Fort Dallas. And after the wars, actually had to pay damages to the Fitzpatrick family, or as part of what Fitzpatrick contended, that he lost buildings that were used for firewood, that all kinds of damage was done as a result of the military use of his property.
I think it was fascinating with your early teen years of, while everybody else was running around on their bike and playing baseball or whatever, you were out there trying to figure out archaeologically what was going on. I think that's fascinating. Do you have some more stories of early days of riding around? I mean, were you going around on your bike and doing this stuff, and you had a couple friends that helped?
I did. All my friends, I was still, even in high school when I, got interested in other things and girls and dating, there was still some interest in archaeology, and I actually did find my way to Arch Creek. And I was, at that time, it was a trailer park. And I did walk through there, and you could see that there were artifacts around the trailer park. So I was always interested in Miami per se, in terms of its history and archaeology. And I became very, very familiar with the city and with the county. And age of 15, I, much to the chagrin of my mother, got onto a Greyhound bus from downtown Miami, and I went to Upper Matacumbe Key, because I had read in the Florida Anthropologist there was a site called one of the at Upper Matacumbe that John Goggin had written about, and I wanted to see it. So I got off the bus at the right place because I knew where it was, and I was able to walk in there. And I did, I was just a kid. I was 15, and I walked into the mangroves and actually thinking into the swamp. And when I did that, I was able to pull myself. There were limbs over my head. I was looking at some terrible 1950s Everglades movie. I thought I had to learn to be cautious and thoughtful. And as it turned out, my plan on getting down there was not so clear, because I didn't have a plan to get back down or not. The Greyhound bus didn't come back until the next day. My mother was really angry at me, and I had to. I spent the night in a trailer that was provided me by Papa Joe, who had a restaurant right there next to the site. So I had a lot of those misadventures as I was trying to kind of find my way and exploring and taking risks. But it was important in terms of my developing my curiosity, but developing my knowledge. And it was a lot to learn. I'll tell you, when I finally.
I think we might have lost him temporarily again. We'll just hang in there. And
just for clarification, is he talking about the southern end of Upper Matacumbe? That's where Papa Joe's, I think, was.
Yeah. Yeah, imagine
That's
that's
correct.
a Hardy Boy novel, doesn't it? Just get on the bus and go, no idea, like, how to get back or what's going on. I mean, that's a wonderful adventure.
Oh,
So what year would have that
well,
been?
it's the dumbness of youth.
What year
Well,
would
that
that
would
have
have
been?
been 1963. 1960.
Well, my grandmother owned a cottage right across the street from Papa Joe's, just a little bit north of Bud and Mary's there at that time. And so you're talking about that there is a channel that runs parallel to US 1 up into Upper Matacumbe Key from the south end. Did you go across that?
That's correct.
And then where from there did you go? There was an Indian mound back in there, right?
Yeah.
We got him back.
Channel. Can you hear me?
Yeah, Bob, we missed whatever the last 15 or 20 seconds might have been there.
Yes. So the site was located on the other side of that channel, and that channel was actually dredge cut by Henry Flagler's railroad construction. So that's dredge was apparently they were keeping dredge boats and things in there. It was a good protection against the storm. So that slip, that dredge canal that.
And, it's interesting that as Bob has spent his whole life finding things, we do have to wait now and then to find Bob again. So
Right.
we'll just have to wait. Here he goes.
We have to unearth him.
Unearth Bob. Here it comes.
So back again, I'm sorry whether, that's just I guess the nature of the internet connection here. So those early years were important in formative years. And when I ended up at Florida State working on my master's degree, I'd gotten scholarships there as well as the University of Florida. So I had to make a choice which school to go to. So I made the choice based on the fact that most of my friends were at Florida State, and I inadvertently I had picked the right school for employment, because the state of Florida's Division of Historic Sites was also located in Tallahassee, as was the National Park Service headquarters for archaeology. Well, I didn't know that. And what that meant was that
I think we lost him as he was about to say grad students.
I was saying that when I got to Florida State, the opportunity employments were right there in that city. Historic sites as a grad student and a position of as archaeologist, and I was one of 3 applicants. 2 other guys, and Ross Morrell was the director. And I got the job, and Ross called me to tell me that I had the job and said to come into the office. And he said, Bob, he said, I want to tell you why you got this job. He said, well, number one, he said, we looked at all the reports that the candidates, applicants did, and you were the only one who could write.
Very
Well,
important.
That's the bottom line, isn't it? If you can write and you show up on time, you get a lot done in this world.
And I just might add, Bob, in the first issue of Preservation Today magazine that I put out for Dade Heritage in 1983, you had a wonderful article about the young man in the river with a picture of a very young Bob Carr, 1983, and talking about the whole river archaeology up to that point and your early adventures. So you were a great writer from the get-go. So,
Well, thank you. And then Ross told me, he said, the second reason we hired you is it's because you're from Miami. I said, really? Why does that matter? He said, well, none of us in this office ever want to go to Miami. So every project south of Lake Okeechobee, you're going. I said, okay, that doesn't hurt my feelings.
So let me ask you about your parents. Do you have a relative, Carr, that did a lot of work with turtles?
Well, Archie Carr is not any direct relation. It's possible far enough back we might be related, but no.
Not directly. Okay, that's what I just wanted to know.
Yeah.
I read his stuff when I was at the University of Florida, of course. You had to read that.
Yeah, well, he was a terrific writer. Boy, he's great.
Hey, Bob, I have earlier on you mentioned about the numerous sites that the DeCesta had in Dade County. I wondered if, and most of them you said were in the Everglades. Is there any record of any of them being in the Redland district?
Well, the Redland district, as you know, and becoming farm country, was basically in pine flatwoods before the farming era. And for that reason, there's very little in the way of prehistoric evidence, with the exception of those many locations that have sinkholes. And there are several parcels that still have the sinkholes, and there are some DeCesta artifacts in those sinkholes. And of course, the Monkey Jungle is not, well, I guess it's in the Redlands, or it's close to the Redlands, right? So there was a major prehistoric activity preserved in the Monkey Jungle because they, preserved the hammock terrain there very nicely. So generally speaking, we don't find any sites comparable to what we find in other parts of Miami and Dade County in the Redlands, but they are very important sites because some of them are very, very old.
Thank you.
What about the area with that natural sulfur spring there, Chiquita Springs, out there? Some people, I guess it's called Grossman Hammock. And I think what the undercurrent to all this is, you find evidence where people gathered in the old days. Like Arch Creek was a gathering point. The mouth of the Miami River was a gathering point. Was there anything about that spring out there that was of interest?
Well, the big news is that spring is a modern convenience that was created in the I think in the 1930s or 40s. It was excavated by the Grossmans. I think it was actually part of an oil well exploration, and then they enlarged it to make a spring. Yeah, you know, don't you, Caesar? You can give them a story.
It was originally an oil. He was drilling for oil, and tapped into some spring, capped it for a while, and then later on, it was a gathering place, and later on the state kind of re-tapped it. Now that area has been closed to the public for many, many years, and they're allowing that hammock to kind of regain itself, and grow over even the public areas that were picnic like. So it's a real jungle right now. And all the gators have moved back in big numbers. And so we don't know if it's going to, be open or hopefully in the future. I have two questions, Bob. Can you tell us about that finish of that wonderful story of being dropped off in a helicopter in the middle of nowhere, and what you heard as the helicopter was zoomed up above your head, another sound that came into being, and secondly, if you remember that story, and secondly, what are you writing today?
Well, I'll be glad to tell you that story. After working for the state for 2 to 3 years, there's an opportunity that opened up in the National Park Service, what they call the Southeastern District, where I was hired to look at sites across the Southeast, specifically to participate in the assessment of sites in the Big Cypress Preserve, which had just acquired. This is 1977, 78. And as part of that work, I was also assigned to work in Everglades National Park, looking at possible, and we did that work by helicopter. I'd never been in a helicopter before, and I have to say I thoroughly enjoyed it. Although on one occasion, while we were flying, the pilot, and he was an ex-Vietnam pilot, and he said, I noticed the helicopter started to wobble and
well, wait a second. Let him come back again. I see that Anthony Atwood had his hand raised too. So Anthony, when we get through this part, let's take it for you.
Thank you.
Yeah. There we go. Is that better?
Yeah, try it again. Go from first ride in a helicopter.
Yeah, one of the first trips I made by helicopter with a pilot who was from the Vietnam veteran. He was a very skilled pilot, so I wasn't worried about any of that sort of thing. But the truth of the matter, and I don't think I've shared this story with too many people, is the night before with our team, I had a terrible dream. And in a dream, I was in a crash, and in this plane crash or whatever was crashing, I had died in the dream, and I actually was elevated out of my body and taken through this tunnel. And when I got to the end of the tunnel, it was a beautiful forest of trees of the species I didn't recognize. And there was a entity, a spirit, somebody there. And as I approached, he said, it's not your time yet. He said, you can go back. And I woke up, and it really it startled my sleep. It was like 4 a.m. I couldn't go back to sleep, and my director for the project, John Ehrenhard, was there. There was about 4 of us in the group, and I said, John, I had this terrible dream. I dreamed that our helicopter plane crashed, and he said, well, that's just a dream. I said, yeah, but it really seemed real. It really was terrifying. And he said, I wouldn't worry about it. I said, well, John, then would you take my place and go on the helicopter today? And he said, oh, no, I'm not going. So I had to go. And sure enough, the helicopter crashed, but it didn't, it crashed. We were down. What's going on? He said, we just lost the Jesus nut. I said, the Jesus nut? He said, yeah, that's the blade. The rotary blade is attached with a nut. And when it gets loose, we go, Jesus. So we landed in the swamps, a relatively soft landing, but that certainly left an impression on me. And unfortunately, that helicopter crashed again 6 months later, and the pilot was severely injured, as was his passenger who had his back broken. So that was definitely part of the risk of that kind of work. But in this particular, on another occasion, we were flying and we landed on an island, and everybody's job logical stuff. So we hop out, we have a shovel in our arms, and the rotary blade, it's very loud, and you have to duck your head and you go down, and we're running to get away from the helicopter. And then the pilot turns off the ignition, and all of a sudden it's quiet, but it wasn't quiet because all I could hear were the rattle of rattlesnakes. And rattlesnakes were rattling in every direction that I walked. And I said to the guy I was working with, his name was Bob too, Bob Taylor. I said, Bob, what's this place called? He said, oh, this is called Rattlesnake Hammock. I said, I'm not so sure that we should be worried about surveying this particular place. And every time we took a step back towards the helicopter, we would hear a different rattle. So we had just run through this field of pygmy rattlers and gotten back. So that, there are those adventures that occur when you're doing this kind of work.
That is an amazing story. Anthony, what have you got on your mind?
I've got the Deering estate on my mind. Bob, it's Anthony here, the chief cook and
Hi,
bottle
Anthony.
on the
Yeah.
Miami Military Museum. I'm between two Zooms. I got to do two at once, and they're out of my telephone, and I'm going nuts. But one of the most exciting experiences in my life was when you were doing the excavation where the Paleo Indians were at the Deering estate, where the spring was, and how you found that. Was so memorable. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, the site you're referring to in the Deering estate was the Cutler fossil site. It was not part of the original Deering purchase by the state and the county. It was a 30-acre out parcel that got outed literally on the day of the acquisition. And I was so shocked to hear that I protested. I protested to the mayor, to the manager, to the state. And they said, well, sometimes you got to make a deal. The Danielson family and Finley Matheson wanted to retain that so they could do commercial development. That was part of why they agreed to do the sale. I said, well, the site in there, I know that it's old because a family, husband and wife team had come into my office, and they had fossil bones from a Pleistocene horse and camels.
Knife handles or something. And
right, because they were looking for wood to make knife handles, but they came in and they had these fossils. So they showed me the site. I wasn't worried about it because it was on the Deering estate. So I said, well, this is going to be preserved, but then it wasn't. So I protested to the Danielson family, and they said, well, look, why don't we just do the archaeology, and we'll, and that way you can make a record of the site. I agreed to that. And because I was going forward to designate it as a 1 acre parcel within the 30 acres to encompass the site. And they didn't want that. They said, look, we'll just do the archaeology. But we did the archaeology, and it was, as many of you know, it was an incredible discovery. It was turned out to be the oldest human site ever found in southern Florida. It was 11,000 years old.
Max,
so I didn't have I don't know what the word is, but for me, the truth was that even though I had agreed that we would not designate, or we would de-designate the 1 acre parcel, I said, look, after this discovery, I don't see how I can do that. I said, this is the most significant site that I've ever seen in southern Florida. It should be preserved. Well, that got them really angry, including I had to go in front of the county commission because they appealed that designation. And I remember one of the commissioners, he said to me, Mr. Carr, said, you've been to that Cutler fossil site, but I haven't been there. Nobody can get there. It's on private property. There's no way in there. so why should we acquire that? Why should we designate it, not acquire it? He said, why should we designate it? And I said, Mr. Commissioner, with all due respect, I said, have you ever been to the Amazon rainforest? And he said, no. I said, well, I don't see any reason why we shouldn't preserve it just because you haven't been there. The commission actually voted to hold up the designation, and that led to the family then deciding to sell the 30 acres to the county and to the state.
But was that part of the original Fuzzard property up there on the north end of the Deering estate? Fuzzard, who had cut the old Cutler Trail?
No, this was on the south end, the very south end near the canal.
But right before you get to that canal.
All right, so
Maybe-
yeah, in the undeveloped part between the big house and the canal cut. Okay.
There's also a Cold War site out there from the 1960s, a cinder block, two-story building half sunk into the ground. It's been all spray painted and half filled with water. Did you ever do any digging with that?
I believe, Tony, that's at Snapper Creek, that site on the north side of, yes, I have seen that over the years, and that actually has been listed as a site with Florida Master Site File, that Cold War site.
Cool. So, but
Yeah.
if I understand correctly, the Paleo Indian site is now part of Dade County?
Oh, yes, yeah, that 30
Hallelujah.
acres.
Okay.
Yeah. That's part of the park.
Well, how wonderful. Great. Thank you.
Well, I'm going to
Thank
show
you.
a few artifacts, a little bit of show and tell here. And these are found at the location of the Royal Palm Hotel. It's built in 1896. I'm holding up a whiskey bottle, a flask. This is from about 1899. This was perfectly preserved under the fill of the parking lot. And in contrast, this was found, this is a shell pendant. This would have been suspended from the hip of a Tequesta Indian. And this was specially made from the columella of a shell, of a conch shell. And it's believed by some scholars that this was actually a fertility amulet used to assure fertility. And finally, in that group of things, the most incredible artifact from the Royal Palm Hotel, we actually dug up one of the Royal Palm keys with the leather room number. Well, I can't see the number now, but that's preserved. So that was actually in the parcel where the Whole Foods restaurant is located. And the last thing I'll show is kind of a little surprise that has never been shared or revealed in a public sense, is that while we were doing work for that, in that parcel on the north bank of the river, we found, and I'm not sure how well this is going to work. Let me see. This is a button, and I don't know, you might not be able to see that. Can you see a design?
Just slightly.
This button is a cuff button and called a phoenix button. It has a depiction of the phoenix bird rising out of the ashes, and it has a regiment number because it's a military button. But the surprise is it wasn't from Fort Dallas in terms of any American soldiers. It's a Haitian military button from Henry Christopher, the first president and king of Haiti from the early 1800s. And the fact this is the only phoenix button ever found in southern Florida. Most of them were found in the Pacific Northwest, and they were used as trade items. How did it become a trade item? It's because the phoenix buttons were made in England by Christopher Henry, who was involved in fighting against the French and trying to protect Haiti from regaining Haiti because of the revolt they had. And he ordered these buttons manufactured for his troops. Now, this is a very shrewd thing. He was a very smart man, by the way, a very a very smart military tactician. Some of you might know the story of how he, to show the French how many men he had, he kept marching the same men out of the fort and going around, and they would come in back through a back hole. So they could count hundreds and hundreds of soldiers. We did the same thing in England. He placed an order for some 30 regiments of soldiers that didn't exist, because he knew that the spies in Europe would know about these button orders from this place that made military buttons. He never collected these buttons and he never paid for them. So the buttons were consequently sold by the manufacturer to an English trader who brought them to North America to use for the Indian trade. And they were distributed to traders across North America. But this was the first one ever found in southern Florida.
That's absolutely fascinating. Now that brings up the subject of what are the rules on finding artifacts and who they belong to? And can you expound on that a little bit?
Well, in Florida, private property is supreme in the sense that any artifacts or objects found on property, private property, are owned by the private property owner. And in contrast, any public property belongs to that public entity. The big exception is that if you find human remains, whether it's on private or public property, it is under the domain of the state of Florida. It's a Florida statute 872.05. And that statute states clearly that human remains are first identified as to their origin and to their affinity. And if they're Native Americans, the Seminole and Miccosukee tribes are notified. It's in southern Florida. And the Seminoles and Miccosukees have a say into what happens to those human remains. So they no longer allow them to be put into museums. They are all repatriated and put back into the ground. So, and including any grave goods that might be associated with them.
That's interesting. So that's the rule. Were there cases where you were working on private property and turned over artifacts to the owner?
There were some. I would always make the case that the artifacts, particularly if they were significant for research or exhibit purposes, were better off at the History Museum. Everything we found, we would turn over to the History Museum. And most private property owners would agree. There was a few exceptions, but 95% of them were happy to see it put into a museum.
Were there significant areas that were grave sites identifiable in Dade County? What were some of the major ones that were found and maybe even lost and found again?
Well, the biggest one was the DeKesta Graveyard Cemetery, located on the MDN property where Whole Foods is located on, what is that, Southeast 2nd Street or 3rd Street, I'm not sure, near 3rd Avenue. That footprint was originally a parking lot. A portion of the Royal Palm Hotel was on the southern part of that lot, but aside from that and a swimming pool, there was never any construction there other than the parking lot, which was there from the 1930s and 40s. So it was there that we found, as it turned out, 500 remains of DeKesta that were buried over years, buried in these large solution holes that were under the parking lot. The state required that they had to be excavated. They couldn't build over it, and they were reburied in a secret, location secret by virtue of the request of the Seminoles that they didn't want that location revealed. But the developer had to pay for the excavation and for the burial of all those human remains.
I imagine it would have been difficult to dig graves, and so you're saying solution holes. Did they wrap the bodies up and put them in solution holes with some sort of ceremonial device?
Well, we've learned the DeKesta and pre-DeKesta mortuary patterns were different through time. There were burial mounds, as we know, that were destroyed. Those were probably late in the DeKesta period, going right up to European contact. But prior to that, many of the burials were associated with water. For example, the Miami River are solution holes because the solution holes had water. Because water was regarded by Native Americans as ghost protection. Native Americans did not distinguish in the way we do between living and the living and the dead. They believed it was part of this continuum of the cosmos, and that if someone died, you had to do the proper rituals in terms of preparing the dead, and that would involve putting the bodies out where they would desiccate in a natural way by natural forces such as vultures and crabs if it was on the water. And that desiccation was an important process because it was part of the soul being taken out of the body into the next world, into the Kesta afterlife, which was essentially a water world. And that was a replica, a reflection, a parallel of their world. And the Kesta, according to the Spanish, believed that there were three souls. One of them was in your eye, the other one was in your shadow, and the third was your reflection in the water. And thus the importance of putting the bodies into the water, which was one of the ways of making sure that the soul was within that particular wet domain, and why so many wet burials have been found in Florida going back 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 years, but right up to the Kesta period.
That is absolutely fascinating. And I imagine the idea of the mounds was when you can't bury, you put in a mound then, right?
Well, it was part of a religious revolution that occurred about 1100, 1200 AD called the Mississippian Revolution, where mound building and temples swept from the Mississippi River area all the way across the eastern United States and to the Midwest. And mound building was a different religious idea that the dead had to be elevated and brought up towards the heavens and put into these mounds. So it was a very different way of dealing with the dead.
And would you build layers on top on these mounds?
Yes, they would have sequential burials, and then they would add soil. Or in Miami, because there's not a lot of soil in downtown, for example, they would add rocks. So the mounds, many of the mounds were rocks. There's only one rock mound left. Well, actually two. One of them is in the Big Cypress. The other one is in Key Largo. And we're trying to get that Key Largo rock mound preserved through public acquisition. We've been working at that for many years, and so hopefully someday that'll happen.
Now, there would have been another kind of mound, which was essentially shellfish eaten and thrown over the shoulder in a mound. And some of the coastal areas, obviously, shellfish was a major part of the diet. And after thousands of years, I imagine these mounds filled in shallow areas, right?
Yes, that's correct. There were shell mounds, which essentially were the living areas, the shell middens, the trash or repository of all this display shell. But sometimes it was very deliberate. They were actually using it as kind of a landfill and building up a particular place. Most of the shell mounds on the East Coast have been destroyed because became the fodder for road construction across the early century. And they were mining all these shell middens for oyster shell to use for roads.
Yeah,
I have a point of clarification I'd like to ask, and that is, you were talking about the mound. I guess it's a sinkhole that's at the bottom of the Deering estate. I'm looking at a map and trying to figure out where that would have been. Can you clarify a little bit more on that?
Well, it's
they try to keep it a secret.
Oh,
yeah, it's on that parcel. Yeah, I'm not going to tell you precisely where it is. I'm going to just tell you it's on that parcel between the canal and the road, and they deliberately the location because it's very hard.
okay, but there's
a fence around.
Oh, okay, and at least from the satellite, I can't see the fence, but there's a Thalia estate south of the Deering estate. And I suppose it's in that area. There's an area that appears to be higher than the other part. Looks like it's mangroves. I'm not sure.
Right. Yeah.
So is this in the mangrove area or the higher area?
Yeah, it's in the that's why it was used, because it was higher.
Higher. Okay. Thank you. I'm sorry to interrupt, but
There was a
No, no.
sinkhole that as kids in the mid '60s, we used to play in and, try to avoid the caretaker and his Doberman pinchers. But there was a sinkhole that we used to play in north of the house off of a main trail. And I think that's it, but I don't know.
Yeah, there were during state, I mean, dozens, and we've done assessments across there, and so there really is a Jim Ransom, the current county archaeologist, has also done an inventory of the sites there in the sinkholes.
Some more questions for Bob on this fascinating talk. Anybody? I see Enid is with us today. Enid, do you have any questions for Bob in terms of some of the work you've done, maybe with the cemeteries or something?
Or the Miami Circle.
What's the question? Is there a question?
Enid, you can turn on your microphone and turn off your mute.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you.
Okay. When the question was asked about the cemeteries, and he gave one cemetery, I was wondering, where did the Lemon City Cemetery, how did it play in that? Is it recognized as a part of what you're talking about?
Well, the Lemon City Cemetery was uncovered about, I'm going to say about 10 to 15 years ago, while they were constructing affordable housing apartments on that parcel. They were under the misbelief that the historically described cemetery that was on the survey had been emptied out of graves. At least the property owner of that time testified that the graves moved, but it turned out that was not the case, because they started finding human remains while they were doing their construction. We were able to verify that the African-American graves were still there. They were intact, dozens of them. And the developer changed their plans. Instead of putting a building over that, he limited the extent of the buildings on the property and preserved that as a green space park as part of the development.
I think that's a great example of archaeology in action. And you can imagine with many of these things, the least of which couldn't be the Miami Circle, that if we didn't have, the archaeological talent and the response and the fortitude to stick up for these things, much would be lost, as much has been lost, no doubt.
I want to take this as a moment of, I suppose, self-promotion, because as Caesar knows, I've just finished a novel. The novel is called The Python Conspiracy, and it is the fictionalized but fairly somewhat accurate account of the discovery of the Miami Circle. And it's called The Python Conspiracy because it's based on the premise that the introduction of the pythons into the Everglades was actually an act of a developer who was trying to get part of the Everglades condemned so it could be developed. Now, again, it's a fictional premise, but I'm hoping to have that book out this year.
That's wonderful. Thanks for the heads up on that. I think Jeff has his hand up. You have a question, Jeff?
Yes, Bob, I don't know that Frank Gentner probably knows about this, but on the subject of cemeteries, there is a burial ground located on the grounds of Neither King Cooper School in Homestead. And I wonder how, what I'd like to do, I've been thought about this for several years. I'd like to get a penetrating radar survey of that area to find out how many graves are there. I don't believe there's any bodies buried there. They were transferred out.
I'll call you back.
But
Okay, good.
I wondered is how feasible is it to possibly start some kind of, who would it contact? How would that be done?
is the cemetery, is it marked? Are there stones that are marked gravestones?
No, no. What it was when Homestead was platted in 1904, it was the Model Land Company, and Flagler set aside, or not Flagler, but his organization set aside a 5-acre parcel for a burial ground. And then along comes more development than they had planned on, and there was a hue and cry about bodies contaminating the water supply. And I wrote a 3-part series on the history of the cemetery, and it's they ended up moving the cemetery out to where it is now in Naranja, but there were bodies buried there. I have one documented burial, which was disinterred and then reburied in Woodlawn, but that's the only one I've been able to locate. I don't know that there were that many burials there, but I don't know. And if we could get a ground penetrating radar survey of the ground, you might be able to find out how many graves were there.
Right, that's what I would recommend. You want to get a GPR assessment, and that'll give you some idea.
How do you go about doing that?
Well, the first thing, everything gets down to money these days, and I suppose always has. So you would have to look for a grant. You would have to look for a sponsoring organization, a not-for-profit group, or a governmental entity to apply for the grant. You just need sufficient money, at least initially, to do that GPR assessment. So you probably need at least $10,000 to $15,000 to do that. But that's, I would recommend.
If you could provide some guidance, maybe I could send you my my articles. It's a 3-part series on the pumps. Yeah. And maybe we could come up with. I talked to the principal at one time, but it got dropped. I was thinking that maybe I would need to go to the school board, but I really don't know how to proceed. I'm just curious because nobody knows. I mean, very few people. The only person that I know knows anything about it is Ed McMichael. But I don't know if Frank knows anything about it or not, but it's just not well known. So, and for the longest time, I didn't believe there was one there, but then I found that documented burial, and I was like, whoa, okay. So, all right, well, maybe I can reach out to you, Bob.
So you can reach out to me, by the way. So if anybody wants to contact me directly, my email address is archlgcl@bellsouth.net. That's archlgcl@bellsouth.net.
Okay, good. Thank you so much.
Well, if anybody has any other questions, feel free to ask.
I'm not.
Otherwise, I'll say I.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
All right. This is John Reiger. This is something new for me because I didn't know about this, but Mary Eaton told me about it. I wanted to say a couple of things before it was over. Bob and I go way back into the mid-70s, and I just wanted to say that Bob was my mentor. I was a professor of history at the University of Miami and did a lot of work on shell tools and on plummets. And I did a book called Escaping into Nature, where I talked about what an important mentor Bob was to me, to all of us, and of course his Archaeological and Historical Conservancy, which has had such a profound impact on saving sites around Florida. I was actually with him and John Berrialt when we were discussing that, and we, the organization, the creation of it, and we kind of probably poo-pooed it to a certain degree. And Bob said, no, I'm going to go ahead with this anyway. And we know what happened when he did. One site in particular that I did a lot of work on in terms of surface collecting and trying to save it is the Otter Mound in southern Marco. And of course, Bob was the sitter of saving that mound, which I'm sure many of you have been to. It's a great site. So I just wanted to tap in here to compliment Bob on his profound impact, particularly in terms of preservation. As a historian, who my PhD is in history, not in archaeology, but there's an awful lot of overlap, of course, in terms of techniques and just conceptualization. But he really brought me along, and we even did an article together in the Florida Anthropologist on a shell celt cache that I found. And I wanted to say one little word about Matacumbi. He talked about visiting it as a teenager. I went on that site I guess it was probably about 1980. I was a professor at Miami from 1970 to 1982. Probably about 1980, I walked over the site and I found a huge mound, a dirt mound of that a looter had created. He dug this very deep hole in the middle of that site, and he had thrown up all of this dirt in a pretty good size spoil mound there. And so I went through it, seeing if there were any artifacts in it. Apparently he was looking for gold or something. He wasn't looking for anything, artifacts, pre-Columbian artifacts. He was looking for gold, I guess. Anyway, and I found this Bussicon tool, and it was all covered in dirt and so on. And I brought it home and I washed it off. And lo and behold, it still had, it was so deep, apparently, it was below the oxygen level. And anyway, there's an article on it in the Florida Anthropologist because the leather binding, the remains of the residue of the leather binding showing exactly how it was hafted, presumably from a key deer, was still on the tool. And that's in the Historical Museum. That's just one of the exciting things that I found in my surface collecting of sites around the state. But most of my work, and Bob was a big help in this too, was having to do with so-called plummets, which now I think most reasonable people believe had nothing to do with, they weren't fishing lures, whatever. And Bob was a great help. I did a couple of articles in the Anthropologist on so-called plummets. But Bob found one of the most important historical citations rather, about these objects. That was from an early European explorer of Florida who talks about the native Indians wearing unicorn horns dangling from their neck. These were the leading men that they met. And Bob immediately understood what could that mean? What would they conceptualize as unicorn horns? Obviously, it was the spiral of the columella of a big whelk, and the fact that they were leading men and they were wearing them around their neck was, again, at least circumstantial, if not direct evidence that these things were not just used in fishing as lures or whatever, as some have said, but they had special significance, and they were definitely pendants. Pendants probably with power, with magic attached to them, possibly fertility, as Bob said earlier. So anyway, I just wanted to, this is a new thing for me. Mary Eaton at the last minute told me about it. You probably can't see me, which is very well because I'm in the shadows, but that's good. I don't need to be seen. But I'm so glad that I got a chance to speak, because probably Bob saw my name pop up and went, gee, bizarre, and he would have wondered if I hadn't said anything. I'm not shutting you, Bob. It's just that I've had trouble figuring out the Zoom process. I'm 78 and I still live in a world of landlines and almost black and white TV. I have moved up the color, but anyway. So anyway, good for Bob. He's still doing his stuff. The guy is incredibly important, as you all know, and congratulations. What I missed some of it. I got most of it, but I've heard some of it before, but not all of it. And I love his stories of childhood because I believe, as I point out in my book, my autobiography, that I spent a lot of time talking about Bob in there, actually, that I believe that what happens in childhood defines who we are. And Bob's own life is an example of that. Thank goodness he wasn't out playing basketball or chasing girls. Well, presumably he did some of that. But hopefully, I mean, it was great for us that he was going under houses, doing various things, probably trespassing and doing all kinds of sort of strange things that most of his compatriots probably had a little interest in. So there it is. Thank you, Bob.
Thank you, John. That was very nice to have your insight and your collaborative evidence there of working with Bob, and certainly very interesting what you were doing there in that find in Islamorada with the leather, the deer leather. Absolutely amazing, and I think it shines a light for all of us on what's out there and unseen and unrealized. And thank you for guys like you going out there and digging up, and I guess thanks for that pilferer who dug up the hole for you, huh?
Yeah, that's right. You know, here was the real prize. I mean, that tool, which showed exactly how they were hafted, which has always been a question, you know, how these Boussicon tools were hafted. That was the real prize that he left behind, digging for, God knows what he was digging for, coins or something. And he just didn't understand it.
Treasure.
Question about that area again in Matacumbe, upper Matacumbe, lower end. Is anything being done to preserve that area?
Well, I don't know, Bob, do you know?
Yes, it's state, it was acquired by the state. It's actually preserved.
But I don't see any fences. There's no markers around there that I have seen.
Yeah, their concern again is looting. So they think that having it in plain sight and sort of invisible by not fencing it is a better way to go.
Yeah.
But it's probably also because they don't have a lot of money allocated for that sort of thing.
Yeah. That is fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. And as it all is. And let me just say thanks to Bob and thanks to all of our friends for showing up and everybody who asked wonderful questions. Does anybody have another question before we go? You can raise your hand and or turn on your mic and ask a question or something. And if not, I will just say thank you so much to everybody for coming out today for a really wonderful, if not technologically challenging program today. But I think we got the gist of what was going on. And I know that probably some of you, like myself, could sit and listen to Bob Carr talk all day and all night for days. And I'm sure there's a million great stories in there. And Bob, if you want to just finish us off with a little something on the way out, please do.
Well, I suppose that it's not unknown to me the fact that at this point in my life, in the winter of my life, that here I am back at the very place I was digging when I was 13, and to the very spot, in fact, where I know I'm at the very spot because there was a grove of exotic almond trees on the parcel, and it was filled with land crab burrows, and these land crabs looked pretty ferocious to me, and I didn't want to get too close to them because some of them were pretty large. And now today in the excavations we're doing, at 3 feet below the surface, we're finding those same almond shells. It's exactly where the grove is, and filled with modern trash that the crabs were bringing down in the hole. So it's kind of a interesting nostalgia to see the where these crabs had once been, and the very place where I had once stood in 1962.
That is truly amazing. That really does bring it full circle, literally. And again, thank you so much, Bob. It's been such a pleasure to have you with us today.
Thank you.
All of us
Great.
history enthusiasts, and we're all big fans of your stuff. And let's look forward to the publishing of your book. And I know we're all going to want a copy of that, and maybe we'll figure out some way to get you in a room with us someday somewhere, and we can all get you to sign them. So that'll be something we look forward to. So
Great.
thank you, everybody. Thank you very much. Later
Thank
on,
you.
we'll put the program on the Miami Pioneers and Natives of Dade website. That's MPNOD.org, and you should be able to find it. Give me a couple of days to figure out how to get it all on there, and then we can have this as one of our wonderful programs to look back on over time. And one of these days, Bob, we'll have you on again when we do a piece on Arch Creek or something. I'm sure maybe if you're available, we'd love to have a little input from you on the importance of Arch Creek and some of the history of it. And that'll be another opportunity to talk with you again. So
I look forward to it. Thank you, everybody.
thank you. All right.
Thank
See you
you.
all next month, everybody. Caesar will be working on getting the speakers coming up for the next month, and we'll announce what's going on very soon. So we'll see you online, and we'll see you in the email, and everybody have a wonderful, happy new year. Nice to see you all.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.